Hello, dear everyone. What's going on? Throughout most of the history shaped by gramophone record collecting research, collecting remains in unclear relation to other forms of consumption of music recorded on gramophone records, particularly during the period when gramophone records were the only media for music reproduction and collections could be observed as seemingly necessary consequence of buying objects which provide access to desired music. In the discourse on record collecting, the dominant idea is that record collecting is perceived as a man's world, which is based on an intellectual approach and systematic collection. It is acknowledged by the size and public presentation of the collection, which is why this type of record collecting is perceived as a particularly closed and discriminatory practice. Moreover, record collectors have often been the topic of novels and movies. Because of this, the already mentioned history of record collectors, viewed exclusively as a man's world, became an almost universally accepted idea. The collectors were given personalities and were portrayed as obsessive, socially maladjusted middle-aged men who compensate for real human relations.
Thank you.
By collecting enormous collections and do not lose the opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge about popular music and its releases. I also became interested in record collecting because of one such fictional collector, Robert Fleming, from the book High Fidelity, written by What Could Be. When I read the historiographical studies of record collecting that were available to me and compared the way they portray collectors with popular representations of collectors, I was confronted with a single story and many whys. I turned to the literature on collecting in a broader sense, especially those studies that deal with collecting in the context of consumerist societies, with a question of what it means to collect. This research helped me to look at what I knew about or as a record collecting all over again, using a concrete system of reference points. The question of difference between collecting and other forms of consumption and their interaction in the historical and contemporary context of consumerist societies was addressed by Russell Belk. So how do you recognize a collector? Referring to the research on consumerism, Belk interprets the key elements of consumption: acquiring, possessing, using, and disposing things we consider valuable, dividing them into material objects, services, or experiences. Collecting differs from consumption in that it applies the creation of collection objects, or less often experiences collected according to some criteria. These criteria are the boundaries that determine what is and what is not suitable for entering the collection, and each collector determines them for themselves. These criteria are largely determined by the topic of collecting, which can be conceptual or perceptual, whereby the rule of inequality between collected objects or experiences must always apply. If we are talking about objects from everyday life, this comprising a collection are removed from ordinary use. In the case of art, the emphasis on aesthetics is given in itself. In collecting, acquisition is a key process, but it is highly engaged, passionate, and frequent. Someone who owns a collection is not necessarily a collector. The collector is more prone to obsessive behavior due to the passion he directs towards the object. However, most collectors, according to Belk, do not show serious signs of obsessiveness, compulsiveness, or addiction. Belk defines collecting as, I quote, "the process of actively, selectively, and passionately acquiring and possessing things removed from ordinary use and perceived as a part of set of non-identical objects or experiences." End of quote. Record collecting has been a research topic in scientific papers for last 30 years. First of all, there was research on record collecting as process, which generally speaking aimed to answer the question of what is valued in this type of collecting. In some of them, there are attempts to outline and interpret the historical development of record collecting. Then there were those studies that started from the record as an object of certain economic, social, and cultural capital, and thus often directly or indirectly included the collecting side of the story. In this presentation, I will be focused on record collecting research in the Anglo-American context and how this research represents collector from the first half of the 20th century. A record collector is a white male who collects classical music. Roy Shuka, in his record collecting study, argues that the first record collectors were those active during the period of 1903 to 1950s who collected cylinders and 78s and established record collecting as a major form of collecting with its own set of practices, associated literature, and appreciation societies. He divides collectors into two groups. One collected classical repertoire, especially vocal opera, and the other collected, I quote, early American music, old-time music, race music, and the various ethnic music associated with American immigrant groups, end of quote. First record collector collected classical repertoire because it was already a well-established and valued art form. What made these collectors recognizable? What was their main occupation? They valorized the aesthetic qualities of recordings. 78s could record about 3 to 5 minutes of music per side. What a classical repertoire fitted into this duration. Collecting records here implies a particular approach to record listening. According to art historian Jonathan Stern, this approach to listening developed in middle-class culture by doctors and telegraphers over the course of the 19th century and gave rise to sound reproduction. It is based on the isolation of hearing from other senses. Were the collectors the only ones familiar with this technique of listening? The media of recorded sound had circulated in society before it became recognizable as primarily musical recordings, but it seems as if it couldn't be seen as collectible before it contained music. Why the media of recorded sound needed classical music to be seen as collectible? Simon Firth argues that all sound recording innovations have been marketed at first on the assumptions that the consumers more concerned about sound quality and the creation of private record libraries are serious consumers consuming serious music. Since 19th century, serious music is that connected to changes in musical life, which made possible considerations of musical canon and stepped up its separation and uplifting in relation to other music. At the core of this change was the positioning of musical work in the center of musical life. For some reason, musical life in which musical works are accomplished in public spaces, concert halls, and opera houses in front of citizenry, helped first record producers in an effort to define the phonograph not like a business machine for taking dictation, but as media whose primary function is sound reproduction and playback for home entertainment. The function of playback by itself imposed creating a permanent record library as an ideal and targeted type of consumption envisioned also by record producers. David Schiessman argues, I quote, once customers bought or were committed to buying an instrument, dealers were to urge them to think not just of acquiring individual recordings, but of amassing a record library, which consumers could see as a testament to their cultivation and good taste, and dealers could exploit as a stimulus to future purchases. Impress on every customer the idea that each new record bought is an addition to his library of music. Get him interested in forming a collection of records. Once started on this basis, he has a fixed object in view, to make his collection as complete as possible, and prides himself on his collection. Furthermore, dealers were to encourage the acquisition of records in a range of musical styles, as befitting a library in order to maximize the customer's long-term interest. Within any category, however, the emphasis remained on cultivating demand. End of quote. Collecting as an ideal and targeted type of consumption puts record collecting researchers in a historical context in a challenging situation, though this is not emphasized in the studies I consulted. By 1910, recorded sound had become the first non-print mass medium that, like other mass media, relied on the consumption of public taste as such. If we look at the earliest record catalogs, they were categorized according to ethnicity and national origin. Also apparent was the division between classical music and popular music. The sales strategy seems to have been motivated by a clear awareness of existing music audiences and was based on the production of recordings to suit their respective tastes. How do we know there were no collectors among members of immigrant musical audiences or other than classical music audience? Commercialization of recorded classical music has opened the question of the social and cultural hierarchy between the art music and its audience and phonograph records and mass media as its consumers. As Igor Kopitov argued, extensive communication homogenizes value, while the essence of culture is discrimination. Therefore, there is a need for cultural singularization of a certain portion of the environment to ensure that some things remain sacred. How could classical music remain sacred when distributed on mass media? Producers carried out singularization by assigning high prices to opera and classic music records, and by limiting the supply of certain red seal records using product scarcity tactics. It was a way to set red seal records apart from other records and make them object of conspicuous consumption and instant collectibles. With the collecting of classical music repertoire as an ideal and targeted type of consumption of records, record collecting research falls into the trap of the production-consumption dichotomy. As Lisa Gittelman argues, I quote, "The production-consumption dichotomy harbors a particular determinism, since it typically puts producers first and then draw an arrow toward consumers. Within this gesture lurks a tendency to use invention and technology as a sufficient explanation of social and cultural change, and this in turn has helped orient media history toward narrative of social effects, and at the same time away from the agencies of any but white middle-class men and the developed world." A record collector is a white male who collects other music. Contrary to the predictions of record producers, as a collector stood out those middle-class men whose collecting developed in the field of other music. John Dugan wrote about the appearance of blues record collectors in the US after World War II, when the 78 records implicitly started to function as a means of transcribing cultural history. Dugan emphasized the relationship between mostly African-American consumers of blues 78s in the 1920s and 1930s, and that of white male record collectors after World War II. Record collectors acted similarly to record label talent scouts, who selected performance, influencing them to record certain type of blues songs, but their positioning regarding canon formation was different. I quote, "As self-appointed keepers of the canon, record collectors treat blues recordings as a series of secular scriptures, discoverable and attainable by hard work and occasional subterfuge. Many of them are immersed in ongoing arguments over canon formation, primary questions of who is more or most influential and where they belong in the artistic pantheon, as well as less intellectualized but still contentious debates over who ripped off whom to have a rare record. They are organic intellectuals, cultural populists who possess a daunting amount of factual information, rejecting what they consider the academicization of the blues and the elitism or archival institutions that keeps the music from the people." End of quote. Collectors operated from a distance and based selection on personal taste, informed by the possibility of justifying their own selection. The publication of the reissue depended on the credibility of the argumentation, a symbolic act of the collection moving from the private to the public domain, which is the ultimate confirmation of the purpose of collecting and which also guarantees the place of a certain issue in the canon. For blues collectors, reaching the broader social significance of the collections helped out the fact that for this music, unlike opera, the imminent medium of transmission was the shellac record, which was on the verge of extinction by the middle of the 20th century. This is one of the reasons for the appeal of those items to collectors. Hunt and the element of surprise have become the main characteristics of this type of collecting. The main occupation was authenticity and rarity. The issue of race as a point of contention is this discourse on collecting gramophone records is made by the fact that the majority of collectors responsible for the presentation of the African-American musical heritage from the beginning of the 20th century are white, and later for the blues and folk revival stimulated by their selection and entrepreneurship. African-American is trying to be presented as secondary demands of consumers, while ignoring the fact that the recording voices are mostly African-American, that the record is primarily a product whose production is aimed at generating profit, and that as such it survives primarily concerning its market demand. On the other hand, white efforts are understood in this sense as intellectual, mindful, selective, organized, confirmed by reissues, and therefore valuable. White listening to blues is a skill as such. It becomes a terrain through which modern power relation can be elaborated, directed, and realized. A request for public confirmation of collecting as a plausible form of extensive consumption has its historical basis. According to Belkin, different types of collecting, the acceptability of a collection is based on the extent to which it appears mature, serious, and knowledgeable. For record collecting, it is important to be a connoisseur. I quote, "Being a connoisseur has meant specialized knowledge about an area of collecting and the corresponding abilities to classify collectibles according to acceptable taxonomies, to possess and exercise taste and judgment, and to assess authenticity and value. In other words, the amateur collector is a passionate subjective consumer, while the connoisseur is a rational objective expert. It is in this respect that the non-connoisseur collector is a perfect exemplar of a consumer culture." End of quote. A record collector is male. I haven't found any story about female record collectors concerning record collecting research. In the first half of the 20th century, I consulted. It seems strange considering record collecting as a home-oriented activity. As Gittelman puts it, I quote, "It must be that homemakers help make home phonographs to the curious and complicated extent that they made homes." End of quote. But the information I have read elsewhere made me think there must have been many female record collectors in the Anglo-American context in the first half of the 20th century. Gittelman argues that gender differences became integral to the definition of recorded sound as a medium for home entertainment. Among the middle and upper classes, some level of musical literacy was expected of all women, and women took care of musical activity within the home. The new medium of recorded sound became intelligible as form of home entertainment according to the ways they interlocked with existing tensions surrounding music and home, professional and amateur, home, public, and ongoing constructions of shopping as something women do. William Kenny, for example, argues that according to a record sale research published in Talking Machine World Journal in 1919, women made the final decision in purchases of phonograph 77.3% of the time. According to this research, women dominated purchases in large and small cities and department and specialty music stores. Men, on the other hand, tended to recognize phonograph as an article of furniture, and woman takes care of those things. For women, the selection, purchase, and playing of phonograph records supplemented and often replaced the playing of musical instruments in the home. I quote William Kenny. Some women could gradually build a library of records, develop a trained musical ear, and read about the lives and careers of all those male musicians. As the leading phonograph trade journal bubbled, women developed more of a fan spirit, take greater interest in the various kinds of music, like to study the personalities of the recording artists and the musical historical surroundings of the different compositions. The objection implied in the word fan better described male perspectives than male plans. Many American women were involved in the retail of the phonograph and records. Women were thought to be most effective in sales because of their skill in social interaction with customers, precisely in socializing with other women. As record catalogs became longer and more diverse and detailed, just learning what was for sale presupposed studying and dedication. Since the average customer had no idea what she or he wanted, saleswomen took advantage of sharp musical memories and hard work to choose the right records for their customers. Conclusions. In 2020, I did research about vinyl record collecting and talked to 12 vinyl record collectors from Zagreb. Half of them were women and half of them were men. They talk about love, passion, selection, and most importantly about their listening practices. Every story was personal and different. They did not want or didn't consider their collecting practices to be in line with dominant ideas about record collectors. The ideas about record collectors referred to those characteristics which they consider negative, to a significant extent more serious or at least different in relation to their own approach to collecting. Describing one's collecting practices went on as comparing and distancing. More recent ethnographic record collecting studies also showed that record collectors demonstrate more diversity, but the samples somehow remain congruous with the dominant idea about record collectors. I think part of the reason for that is the way researchers were fighting their interlocutors. They put ads on social media, and those whose collecting practices coincided with popular assumptions about record collecting would fill out the questionnaire. Researching record collecting in a historical context could be approached in two ways: by following stories about collectors in print media or by researching individual collections. All studies I consulted made their conclusions following stories about collectors in print media. The question is, who as a collector can get into print media and the public sphere at which historical moment? How was the word collector used and for what purposes? If recorded sound became the first non-print mass media, the question is, how did music enable that? What kind of magic happened? Big part of using recorded sound is repeated play, and people play their favorite music again and again. What does music do to us that makes us want to have a collection and be able to listen to our favorite songs whenever we want? Why is collecting a common type of music consumption? In that sense, maybe collecting shouldn't be the only keyword through which we investigate collecting. Maybe we should see collecting behavior among stories about consumers too. Maybe that's why record collecting always needed something to make ordinary consumption more special, and what made it special had to be personal and publicly confirmed. Thank you.